A reading from the book of Job. There was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, and a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Skin for skin. All that people have they will give to save their lives. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, he is in your power, only spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Job took a potsherd from which to scrape himself and sat among the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. This is the word of the Lord.
Elie Wiesel may be a familiar name to many of you because of his 1958 book entitled Night. I still remember my heart racing as I read this book in high school and found myself entering into his teenage suffering. He was 15 years old when he and his family were packed into a train car headed to Auschwitz. He was born in what later became Hungary, and his full name was Eliezer, help of God. But Jewish biblical names were illegal in Hungary at the time, so he was called Eli. His most famous book tells the story of he and his family being deported during World War II because of their Jewish identity and faith. Upon arriving at Birkenau, Eli was stripped of everything he had. He was stripped of his clothes and his possessions. He was stripped of his hair as his body was shaved, and his mother and sister who were separated from him forever. Now, we don't need to lay out all of the sufferings that he and his family endured, but if you've read the book, you'll know that he and his father felt their faith and their identity slowly fading until it seems that they were only husks of human beings. Eli recalls that they became so desensitized to human suffering that the men in the camp had no tears left for loss of life. Until one day they saw the death of a young boy on a gallows. And in that moment, Eli heard the voice of a man behind him ask, "For God's sake, where is God?" He wrote, "And from within me, I heard a voice answer, 'Where is God? This is where, hanging from these gallows.'" The God that Eli knew must be dead if these horrible things could happen. Now, there are some questions that we as humans are haunted by. Who is in? Who is out? What's the right thing to do? And just how far is too far? Can we trust the polls in this next election? What am I going to eat after church? These are questions that we mull over and that we come back to again and again with election cycles and with our Sabbath practices. But we've also all been faced with that question that Eli heard from behind. Where is God when terrible things happen to good people, to lovely people, to beautiful people, to innocent people that we love? A lot like Eli, Job in our scripture this morning is the quintessential example of this question in human experience. Did you hear how our Old Testament reading described him this morning? He has turned away from evil his entire life. He has never turned his back on God. Yet somehow, for some reason, evil turns up in this man's life. Why does evil befall Job, of all people? The rest of his story will deal with this question, but the opening prose gives us a simple and troubling answer. It seems that Job was the perfect test subject for God and the Satan to conduct an experiment, or perhaps even to satisfy a bet. Now, I need to make one note about the Satan. You no doubt noticed that I called him the Satan. The title Satan means accuser, and he is sort of the heavenly prosecuting attorney that brings charges against humans. The translation we've read this morning calls him Satan with a capital S. But in the original language, this is more of a title than a name, and it's accompanied with a definite article, the Satan. So later in theological history, he may in fact become the devil, Satan with a capital S, but just know that that's not quite who we're talking about at this point in biblical history. So, God is in the heavenly conference room. And as usual, the heavenly beings working the earth job site are late for staff meeting. Finally, they arrive, and God asks the Satan, "Where have you been?" "Oh, the usual. I've been perusing the job site and keeping an eye on the slackers." "Oh yeah? Staying busy, huh? I'll see how he handles a tough case. What charges would you bring against my servant Job? You know him. The guy from Uz, who's never done anything wrong, who's blameless and upright, who fears me and turns away from evil." The Satan says, "Sure, I remember him. But why do people serve you anyway? He's perfectly faithful to you because his life is perfect. As soon as he thinks you've been unfaithful to him, he'll turn away." Call it scientific research, call it a friendly wager, God and the Satan end their meeting by agreeing to test Job's faith by stripping him of everything. And the story doesn't let up. In one terrible day, Job loses everything he has: his cows and his camels, his sheep and his servants, and ultimately all 10 of his children perish in one day. Job hears this news in a matter of minutes, and undoubtedly he grieves his children, but he continues to bless God. The text says, in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. Now, the Satan could have pushed the chips across the table to God at the end of chapter 1, but he doubles down in our text this morning. The Satan accuses Job of being a sociopath. His children mean nothing to him if he saves his own skin. So they up the ante, and God allows the Satan to inflict a skin disease on Job's entire body. Can I be bluntly honest with you for a second? The Bible can be rough. If we think that God is speaking to us and working through the words of this book, God is not letting us off the hook this morning. Here's what I wish I could preach to you this morning from the book of Job. God wasn't involved in Job's suffering. The devil did it. Things happen, but God doesn't direct these things. God comes especially close to you in your suffering. When you tear your clothes like Job and you sit in the ashes of grief, God is in the dirt beside you. Y'all, that's a sermon that I think I believe. When I hear stories of immense suffering, the God that I've experienced doesn't do those things. When I think of my own family members whose lives have been wrecked by alcoholism or have been ended by mental illness, those things are demons, not God. They're diseases, I know, and they have to be treated as such, but their power to crush souls can only be called demonic. The love I've felt from God tells me that God didn't do this. God is willing the world toward peace and justice and healing. Now, sadly, the book of Job doesn't allow us to find that truth easily and comfortably. Job goes on for most of the narrative to sit in his grief and demand answers from God. He maintains his own righteousness in the face of people who preach at him. God only causes grief to evildoers. But Job sits in his grief obstinately and accuses God, waiting for an answer. Job is grieving. Job is angry. Job accuses God of injustice, and Job calls on God to defend God's own actions. For God's sake, he might have said, where is God? The part of the story that we really have to wrestle with is God's lack of an answer. God's response is little more than, who are you to critique me? Did you create the cosmos? Did you measure the foundation of earth? That's what I thought. So Job backs down. Job admits that his knowledge is limited and that the mystery of God is more than he can fathom. And apparently Job cannot know where God was when evil turned up. And so, as we so often find, the book of Job leaves us with more questions than answers. However, what is Job really trying to teach us? What if we imagine the book of Job as an example of how to remain faithful in suffering, instead of a theological defense of God's actions in times of suffering? The final chapter of Job, God indicates that Job has spoken what is right about God. God now defends Job as blameless and upright. Job has apparently continued to turn away from evil and turn toward God in all of his anger and grief. So if Job's faithfulness looks like an angry, obstinate interrogation of God, we have to wonder, what does faithfulness look like for us? By the end of night, Elie Wiesel had not found any rekindled faith after witnessing what he interpreted as God's death in that camp. The God that Elie thought he knew could not be alive. However, in 2001 and again in 2005, Kathleen Falsani interviewed Elie in his new home in New York City. And he explained his resurfaced faith. Doubt is there all the time, he said softly. The questions are there, and all my questions are stronger than all my answers. But I am who I am. I cannot not believe. He says, I accept having faith. I call it wounded faith. My faith is wounded. But I believe no faith is as pure as a wounded faith, because it is faith with an open eye. I know all the elements of the situation. I know all the reasons why I shouldn't have faith, and I have better arguments against faith than I have for faith. Sure, it's a choice, and I choose faith. He goes on to say that when he chooses faith, he chooses to believe that God is on the side of the victims and not the perpetrators. Eli witnessed profound evil, but Eli also knew God and knew that the Creator of all the world has a beautiful and a good vision for our world. He did not shy away from his questions and doubts, but he questioned why God allows the world to be as it is. And he harnessed this tension that he felt with his faith to work toward the world as it should be through his political activism. He spoke out on behalf of anyone who was threatened with the same genocide that he had survived. Job and Elie Wiesel have this in common. Neither of them can fully explain for us God's actions or inaction when evil turns up. But both remained faithful to God by turning away from evil and facing God and facing the world with their anger, with their doubt, with their questions. As people of faith, we're called to follow Job's example, as Eli did. When suffering comes, we can use the full spectrum of our emotional capacity to find freedom and to grieve. And friends, God can handle our anger. God can handle the reality we experience, and God is not aloof from us, even when we're not sure we can handle it ourselves. God engages with our anger and doubts. God never left Job, and God sits with us in the dirt of our suffering and hears our anger. Now, the book of Job is focused on the individual, on Job's own faith. But anger and doubt are acts of faithfulness appropriate for a Christian community as well. We share our frustration with the world as it is. Reverend Dr. Freddie Haynes of Friendship West Baptist Church in Oak Cliff down the road was here for our preaching practicum 2 weeks ago. He told us that when he is out protesting the continued oppression of black people in our nation, many accuse him of inciting chaos. His reply was that the maltreatment of black people causes anger at the world as it is, and that these protests that many see as chaotic are actually a venting of that anger. And when this anger, this righteous anger is vented, it can change suffering, and it can change our world to bring healing. But if anger is bottled up and ignored, it can explode and multiply suffering. Many of us in this room are angry. You may be angry at those memories and images that have bubbled up over the last couple of weeks as remembered trauma. You may be angry at the rotting feeling in your stomach when you read the news about tsunamis and earthquakes, violence and hunger. You may be angry because you've had to watch the suffering of friends that you have survived. And friends, I want you to know this morning that we are angry with you. As people of faith who have a vision, God's vision of how the world should be, we're angry with our black brothers and sisters who suffer unjustly. We're angry that people continue to suffer, and God welcomes our anger. So friends, the reality is that when evil turns up in our lives, we are only unfaithful by accepting it without challenge. If we accept that God is inactive and the world as it is the way that it must be, then we've gone too far. Instead, friends, we should be angry, knowing that God wills something better for our world, that the Creator revealed to us in Jesus envisions a world as it should be, a world of peace and justice and comfort for all. So, friends, when evil turns up, embrace your pain and the anger that comes with it. Face God and face the world and turn toward healing action for those around you. Amen.